In my last theory video for Night in the Woods, I explored a potential connection between Aunt Molly and the cult. Ultimately, I concluded that she doesn't support the cult or even know about them. And while she does suspect something sinister is going on in Possum Springs, she's too much of a biased mall cop to actually figure it out. But what about the city council? Again, just like with Molly, the Weird Autumn edition includes them in the epilogue, eliminating the possibility that they're full-fledged members. But could they be cult supporters? Are they in their pocket? Do they simply know about them? Or are they, like Molly, entirely unaware of what's really going on in Possum Springs? The answer, as I see it, is a bit of a mixed bag. Based on a combination of textual and circumstantial evidence, I've come to believe that half of the city council members know about the cult and probably support them, while the other two members are completely in the dark. First, let's take a look at the composition of the council. There's Gary, a bird, Andrew, a bear, Colleen, a dog or a fox or whatever animal the Greg species is, and Kathleen, a crocodile. As pointed out by Mrs. Albatross, this is a mirror image of the main characters, of Germ, Angus, Greg, and Bee. And if you add in Molly, who's frequently seen with the council, then you've got a counterpart for May as well. This casting is far too deliberate to be coincidental. So right from the beginning, it's clear that the developers wanted us to view the council as a foil to the core quintet. The implications of this are really interesting, and it's a topic I intend to explore further in a future video. Now, we're going to look at each council member in detail later, but before we get there, let's take a look at the big picture textual evidence. Though May never directly interacts with the council, not once does she speak to them herself, she does observe them several times throughout the game. On day 5, May finds them out past the church, talking to Bruce at his campsite. All 4 of them are pretty condescending to Bruce. They mock his living arrangements, try to sick Molly on him, a ploy she doesn't fall for, and go to great lengths to make him feel unwelcome. The issue lingers for a couple of days, as Pastor K does everything she can to convince the council to use some of the town's abundant space to house Bruce and other homeless people. But it's not until day 10 that they go gloves off. In a conversation with Pastor K, they reveal unanimous opposition to her plans, giving away the result of the vote that's set to take place later that evening. They dehumanize Bruce, make it sound like he'd be a danger to children, and refuse to address the issue of homelessness in general. Their words are bad enough, but when we learn that homeless people are among those targeted by the cult, all of this takes on an entirely different, darker context. There's just no way to view the council's decision without considering the fact that it obviously benefits the cult. If homeless people have a place to stay in Possum Springs and a community of people to support them and help them get back on their feet, then the cult can't keep feeding them to the black goat, because then that community would get suspicious, and eventually, they'd be exposed. The timing is also incredibly suspicious, as the bulk of Bruce's arc takes place post-Harfest, after May has seen Ide kidnap someone, and reaches its conclusion on day 11, the same day May learns the truth about the cult. So I think it's safe to say that the developers wanted Bruce to be on our minds while we're down there confronting the cult. That having been said, it's not unusual for people in power, and politicians especially, to look down on the homeless and want nothing to do with them. It's an attitude that, unfortunately, permeates both parties. So I'm not ready to brand them as cult supporters based on this alone. But there is one piece of circumstantial evidence that alludes to a connection between the cult and the city council as a whole. During her trip to the Possum Springs Historical Society, a public, government-funded institution, May finds a picture of the black goat in the basement. This is noteworthy because it suggests a connection between the highest levels of Possum Springs government and the cult. And since we don't see any government members other than the city council, the implications are clear. Furthermore, while each of the detective segments includes an exploration of the town's history, this is the only one that so obviously alludes to the cult. So it sure seems like the developers wanted us to make a connection between this image of the black goat and the town's government, the city council. But then again, this is a single painting locked away in a largely forgotten basement. It could have been placed there by the museum curator. Maybe they're a cult member, which would help explain why Ide hangs out there. We have no way of knowing how often the city council visits the historical society, or if they even view it favorably at all, just that it's a public building that they must be funding to keep open. So while it's an interesting find, it's hard to gather any real conclusions from it. In terms of textual evidence about the cult and the council, we do have one other point to consider. According to the wiki, the cult states that the council isn't putting the town first. Personally, I can't find that line in any of my footage, but I do believe it, as it falls somewhat in line with similar statements they've made about the government. If you can find a screenshot of this line, I'd appreciate you sending it to me. But in any case, this statement certainly reflects a negative opinion of the council, which would lend credence to the belief that the two are completely unaffiliated, that all four members are entirely unaware of the cult's existence. But that's just the thing. The city council has 4 members. By saying this, they might be referring to the government body as a whole, and not individual members. It's entirely possible for the cult to agree with the politics of certain members while still hating the council overall. So to find answers about the city council and the cult, what we need to do now is start looking at specific members. The city council member with top billing is probably Gary. In the demo version of the game, he was originally the only council member. Whenever they leave an area, he's the one who dismisses them, saying, "Troops, move out." This suggests that he's either their de facto leader or their senior-most member, or possibly both. And across their appearances, I'd argue that he's the one with the most well-established personality. And what is that well-established personality? Well, I think he's best described as a hot-headed conservative bigot. From the very first moment we see him, he's arguing with Andrew, and in a rather intense manner. He kicks us up a notch when we run into the council in the trolley tunnel, the morning after Lori M paints Nuke Possum Springs over the mural of the dudes. In response to the vandalism, Gary tells Molly that he wants to see the person who did it hang. He wants them to hang. It's a pretty extreme reaction, one that clearly disturbs Molly. This is exactly the type of thing that you'd expect someone in the cult to say. As I mentioned in my video about Molly, you'd expect the cult members to have a reverential view of the town's history. Here, Gary wants someone who profaned that history to be executed. That's about as reverential as it gets. And Gary's admiration for the history of Possum Springs doesn't stop there. His initial argument with Andrew is over the historical value of the statue, and on the day of Harfest, he insists that they put up the hit record, a Ferris wheel, because it's something that they've always done at the festival. This, of course, is classic conservative thinking. Speaking of politics, Gary is also the member with the clearest set of political views. He often talks about the importance of catching the attention of the market and bringing in new businesses to Possum Springs. As he puts it, businesses mean jobs, and jobs mean people. During the city council's last conversation with Pastor K, he goes really off the rails, calling Bruce and other homeless people bums. When you combine these two things, his statements about the town's economic difficulties and his cold, hateful comments about homeless people, what you get is a condensed version of what the cult says down in the mines. While it's true that this is, to some extent, a typical small-town political philosophy, for Gary to make a statement so similar to something said by the cult just a day before May discovers the cult cannot be a coincidence. The developers made these statements similar for a reason. There's a few other pieces of circumstantial evidence linking Gary to the cult. This will be a topic for another time, but several of the bird characters, including the janitor, Germ's grandmother, and to a lesser extent, Germ himself, seem to have connections to the supernatural. And on the night of Harfest, when May sees Ide and thinks he's a ghost, what cutout does Gary use during the water balloon toss minigame? A ghost! Once again, the timing here is really suspicious. In any case, as it pertains to Gary, I think you can dismiss any one of the points I brought up individually. But combined, it's clear to me that there's something there. Personally, I believe that Gary is in the cult's pocket. I think he supports them from afar, doing just about everything but attending their meetings. I mean, come on guys, he's a politician. As foolish as he's portrayed to be, he probably knows better than to actually go down into the mines and worship the black goat in person. So with Gary out of the way, what about the other members? On first glance, I thought there was no way that Colleen, the dog slash fox slash member of the Greg species, was at all connected to the cult. But a series of comments from her have led me down a different path. I've come to believe that she definitely knows about the cult and might be supporting them as well. A few smaller pieces of evidence include the statement she makes about Bruce. In the city council's conversation with him, it's Colleen who calls him a drifter, which is one of the terms the cult specifically uses to describe the types of people they target. And in the same conversation where Gary calls Bruce a bum, Colleen suggests that keeping him around would be a danger to children. So aside from Gary, she's really the council member who looks down on Bruce the most. These might just be bigoted comments by an out-of-touch politician. But another piece of dialogue from Colleen, in my opinion, puts it over the edge. After Gary gets done fantasizing about murdering the person who vandalized the mural of the dudes, the city council gets into an argument about what to do about the trolley tunnel area. With the dudes forever besmirched, some of them feel that there's no value to keeping it open, which is an interesting statement. In any case, Kathleen, the crocodile, floats the idea of turning the space into a rest home, which is also an interesting idea. In response, Colleen says that they are, quote, not going to put our elderly in a hole. Not going to put our elderly in a hole. I mean, holy shit, guys. That's a very suspicious comment for a person in this game to make. It's so on the nose and so clearly an allusion to the cult. At first, I thought it was just a small tease stuck in there by the developers. Kind of like when Garbo and Molloy mentioned a cult during their broadcast. But when viewed alongside everything else, I think it's more than likely a wink nod from Colleen to Gary about his status as a cult supporter. So when it comes to Colleen, I think that she knows about the cult and turns a blind eye to their actions. She might support them, but there's not a bunch of circumstantial evidence to back it up like there is with Gary. So I'm more inclined to say that it's a situation where she approves of them and allows them to continue operating because it helps further her own agenda. But what about Andrew and Kathleen? Though they both shoot down Pastor K's attempt to establish a homeless shelter, as I mentioned earlier, there's a number of depressing reasons why they might be so heartless. And aside from that, there really just isn't that much to go off of. Andrew does show some reverence for history. He too often describes things around the town as, quote, being of historical note, but he seems to have a specific criteria for this. For example, he says that the trolley tunnel is of historical note, but in his very first appearance, he's arguing with Gary about why he thinks a statue in town is not worth keeping up. So unlike Gary, he doesn't go around preaching that everything in Possum Springs is historical, which seems to run counter to the cult's ideology. As for Kathleen, we don't hear much from her over the course of the game. At least, nothing that stands out in the way the comments from Gary and Colleen do. There are actually a few scenes where she appears, but doesn't say anything at all. When she does speak up, it's usually to mediate conflict, as she attempts to do during the discussion about the statue, or to propose solutions, even if they are, well, kinda unusual. Like when she recommends turning the trolley area into a rest home. It's not the worst idea I've ever heard, but there are definitely better places for somewhere like that. So, in summary, I think that Gary supports the cult from a distance, I think that Colleen knows about the cult and turns a blind eye to them, and I think that Andrew and Kathleen don't know about the cult at all. Now, if that's the case, then I think our next question should be why. Why is it that Gary and Colleen know about the murderous uncles while their counterparts are still in the dark? I think that there's a clue about this in their character design. Look at the 4 city council members side by side. If you look closely, you'll notice that Gary and Colleen are fairly dressed up, while Andrew and Kathleen are dressed more casually. This, to me, suggests that Andrew and Kathleen are probably newer members to the city council, because politicians dressing in this style is a fairly recent development. This is all stealing a page from tarnished archaeologist's playbook, but if you look at the history of dressing like this in politics, you didn't see it much until about 2012, when both Barack Obama and Mitt Romney made a point of wearing jeans at their campaign events in an attempt to look more like everyday people. So if this is the case, and they are newer members to the city council, then it's likely that they simply haven't been involved in politics for long enough to have made contact with the cult. Maybe the cult has yet to reach out to them because they're unsure if they can be trusted. I mean, think about it, guys. All it would take is for one person in power to expose the cult, and it'd all be over for them. As for Gary and Colleen, given that they're dressed in a manner more typical of a long-serving politician, I think it's pretty likely that they've been in office for a while. Maybe even since the 90s, when the cult first got started. It's pure speculation, but maybe Gary started out as a full-time member, became a politician to support their cause, and has been supporting them from the shadows ever since. As for Colleen, maybe she caught Gary meeting up with Ide, or one of the other cult members, and decided to look the other way when she found out that their methods furthered her own agenda. So as I see it, half of the city council members either support the cult or know about them, while the other half know nothing at all. And if the cult does feel like the city council isn't doing enough for the town, as the wiki suggests, then this breakdown helps explain why. Because only one of the council members is truly on their side. But what about the rest of the townsfolk? Is there anyone that we meet in-game who might be a cult member, a cult supporter, or just simply know about their existence? I've identified a list of characters that are, in my opinion, at least worthy of discussion. But what about you? Is there anyone you think might be in the cult? If so, let me know in the comments, and I'll be sure to cover them in my next theory video, where we'll take a look at a bunch of minor characters and their potential connections to the cult. See you guys then.